Now that we've defined consumer and producer surplus and explored how competitive markets result in the maximization of producer and consumer surplus, we can explore situations where that move the market out of equilibrium. So, for instance, in this competitive market equilibrium, we've made society as well off as possible, both producers and consumers. Overall, society is as well off as possible. But it's possible for individuals within economies to make themselves better off, even at a competitive market equilibrium. But in order to do so, in order to make themselves better off, someone else is going to have to be made worse off. So one such way to make yourselves better off in a competitive market equilibrium is for small groups of either consumers or producers to lobby the government to intervene in the market. And one of the ways they can do that is by setting price floors and price ceilings. So these sorts of price controls, and two types we'll look at in this section. A price ceiling is a legally determined maximum price that sellers can charge, and a price floor is a legally determined minimum price that sellers can receive. The United States has a market economy. There's very little price setting going on and centralized government control, but there are a few examples of where where these types of policies exist. So they include minimum wage, rent controls, and agricultural price controls. And we're going to explore the effects of these policies in this section. Let's begin by looking at a price floor. In this case, we'll look at the economic effect of a price floor in the wheat market. Price floors in agricultural markets are very common. They've been common since the Great Depression. In the Great Depression, one of the many things that went wrong in the economy is the price of crops fell substantially between when farmers planted their fields and when they went to harvest them. So because of that, because these prices fell, they were unable to recoup the amount of money they put in to planting their fields. So they were unable to repay their loans at the end of the year. Because of this, there's a lot of pressure for the government to enact price floors to ensure that farmers were able to receive enough so they can pay back their loans. So let's see how this would work. So in equilibrium here, the price is going to be where the supply curve crosses the demand curve. So in this case, $6.50. And at $6.50, the quantity traded, the equilibrium quantity, is going to be 2 billion bushels of wheat per year. The consumer surplus is going to be the difference between the demand curve and the price of $6.50. And the producer surplus is going to be the difference between the price of $6.50 and the supply curve. Now let's suppose wheat farmers convince the government to impose a price floor of $8 per bushel. At this price, what's going to happen is the quantity traded is going to fall to 1.8 billion. At this higher price, that's all consumers are going to be willing and able to pay. So there'll be a reduction in the quantity that's traded. And it's important to note that when you set a price floor, it's going to be higher than the equilibrium price. So now the area of rectangle A, that's going to be transferred from consumers to producers. So that was part of the consumer surplus. It's now part of the producer surplus because the price has risen to $8. Now areas B and C, these rectangles are going to be the deadweight loss. Remember, these are the trades that aren't able to take place. In a competitive market equilibrium, consumers will be willing to buy 2 billion bushels per year. But because of this artificially high price, we're ending up with only 1.8 billion of bushels being bought by consumers per year. So deadweight loss represents these trades, the value of these trades that are not taking place. Unfortunately, we don't just end up with some deadweight loss and some higher prices being paid for wheat. The situation may be even worse. Because farmers are receiving $8 per bushel, they don't realize they won't be able to sell all of their wheat. So they'll be willing to plant up until the marginal cost equals $8. So if we trace that out in the supply curve, that's going to lead to farmers producing 2.2 billion bushels per year. Now consumers are only demanding 1.8 billion bushels. So we end up with a surplus, an excess of supply of 4 million bushels of wheat. So some of these farmers are going to be planting wheat that they're unable to sell in the market. So they'll lose a ton of money on this. So this forces governments to enact further policies to try to solve this. So they may buy the surplus wheat. They may pay the farmers to let some of their fields lay fallow to reduce the supply. They may end up with other schemes giving farmers subsidies to make up for the wheat that they're unable to sell. And we saw this take place in the Great Depression. Um, One of the tragedies of the Great Depression is when people were standing in food lines, unable to afford and to get food, and you had the government paying farmers for their wheat and just destroying it or letting it lie in fields. And we see the same thing today going on in India, where they have price controls for some of their agricultural products, where they just have mounds and fields sitting there rotting while people are unable to eat. Now let's look at another example. This time we'll turn to the labor market. So an example of price floors in the labor market is minimum wage. So supporters of minimum wage, they see it as a way of raising the income of low-skilled workers. Now opponents, on the other hand, argue that it results in fewer jobs and imposes a large cost on small businesses. So if we assume that the minimum wage does decrease employment, it must result in some deadweight loss for an economy. So look at the figure on the right. When the labor market's in equilibrium at wage W1, the equilibrium quantity of labor is going to be L1. Now, in labor market is a little bit different. So demand for workers, demand for labor is going to be the firms themselves. They're the consumers in this market. And the workers in this market are going to be the producers because they're actually selling their labor. So now if we place a minimum wage in this market, so we increase the wage above equilibrium, what we're going to get is a surplus of workers. Firms are going to reduce employment because now labor costs are higher. So at this new labor cost, they're going to demand fewer workers. While at the same time, we're going to increase the supply of workers. More workers will be willing to work at this new higher wage. So we end up with a surplus of workers. We have workers that are unable to find employment because of this new higher minimum wage. We also end up with a deadweight loss. So the two triangles between L1 and L2 and the supply and demand curves, those are deadweight. That's the deadweight loss. Those are the economic surplus that could be gained by individuals working at the minimum wage, but they are unable to find a job. They don't find employment because of the new higher minimum wage. So now let's turn to price ceilings. A price ceiling is the limit to what price sellers can sell in their product by law. These are typically demanded by consumers. It helps them at the seller's expense, unlike price floors, which help the producers. So our first example, let's look at rent control. Many large cities tend to have rent control. So it prevents apartment landlords from selling at prices above a certain price. So let's say without rent control in this market, the equilibrium price is $2,500 per month. At that price, the equilibrium quantity that's going to be traded is 2 million apartments. Let's say the government imposes a rent ceiling of $1,500. The quantity of apartments supplied are going to fall to 1.9 million. Again, because at this lower price, the marginal cost is going to be too high for some landlords to be able and to be willing to rent apartments. But at this new lower price, 2.1 million people will want to rent apartments. So we end up with a shortage of apartments.
So what this shortage is going to do is reduce producer surplus. So part of that previous producer surplus is going to be captured by tenants. And then we're going to get deadweight loss from those 100,000 rentals that would take place in equilibrium that are now no longer taking place in under rent control. So we end up with the direct effect of the shortage of housing. But there are also some indirect effects that result from rent control. So first, you end up with discrimination based on other factors besides the willingness and ability to pay. So it could be legal and ethical ways, so like how loud the tenant is, how much they party, how much they annoy their neighbors. It could be things like things that are unethical, so like race, religion, age, these sort of protected classes. Or they could just give apartments to friends or through connections. So the only way to get one is to know somebody. It also results in an inefficient usage of housing. So it encourages people to remain in places long after they no longer need them. So we end up with inefficient and wasteful rentals, preventing people from finding the best place for their needs. So, for instance, you have an old couple who lived in an apartment for, say, 50 years. And it's under rent control, so it's very cheap. but they know it's difficult for them to go find a new apartment. They may have needed the extra space. They had kids living in their house, so they had the 4-bedroom apartment, but now it's just the two of them. They no longer need that much space. But they're going to be very hesitant to go and get a new apartment when it's so difficult to find one and when the price may be higher than what their rent control is. So because of this, it benefits long-run renters over new renters. So people moving to the area trying to find an apartment are going to suffer because they have this shortage of apartments. So it's going to be more difficult for them to move to the area. We also see a decrease in the investment in housing. Obviously, if you can't get the returns from rent to satisfy the cost of building, you're not going to build. So this reduces the number of new projects that are going to take place. So many landlords will be unable to build a new complex and recuperate the funds that they've spent on it. So they're going to be less likely to to build new housing. Additionally, existing properties may be converted to office spaces. So office rentals typically aren't covered under rent control, so they're able to fluctuate with the market prices. Um, so knowing that you can make more selling retail space or office space, more complexes may be converted, causing a further shortage in housing. And we see this in cities like New York, where you end up with a shortage for apartments, but you end up with like 7 to 12% of um, of office spaces not currently being rented, being open and available. And finally, we see quality deterioration. So the prices of rent stay the same, but the cost of everything else in society is increasing. Inflation rises over time. So the prices of the goods and services required to keep up apartments end up increasing, while the money landlords receive are staying the same. So what's going to happen? Rather than lose money, landlords will start using cheaper materials, they'll make repairs less often, and the quality of apartments are going to deteriorate. Eventually, it's going to be too much to upkeep these apartments at all. If you're receiving $400 a month for an apartment in New York City, it's going to be very difficult to even pay your taxes on that building, let alone pay for repairs in 2020. So eventually, they can't afford any repairs, and rather than lose money, they'll abandon the apartments. And again, in New York City, we saw this quite a bit with whole city blocks being abandoned and landlords just walking away because there was no way for them to make enough money to satisfy the costs associated with owning and renting out an apartment. So again, in the long run, this is going to decrease supply. So in the short run, we see a small reduction, a small shortage of apartments. But in the long run, this shortage will increase over time as we have rent control.
And here we see the effect of rent control on producer surplus and consumer surplus. So this rectangle A, which previously was producer surplus, is now going to be captured by consumers. So those consumers that are able to rent an apartment are getting this now additional consumer surplus. But those that are unable to rent, that would have been able to rent at the competitive market equilibrium, but no longer able to rent, they're represented in this deadweight loss. So the combination of triangles B and C. So we end up with producers, the landlords renting apartments, losing some of their producer surplus. We have the consumers gaining some consumer surplus, but then we see this deadweight loss of people that want to rent, that would have been able to rent, but are now unable to rent because of rent control. So the shortage of apartments that exist under rent control may lead to a black market. So black markets are markets in which buying and selling takes place at prices that violate government price regulations in this case. Black markets exist anywhere that trades that people want to take place are going to be illegal. So maybe the good has been prohibited entirely. Maybe taxes are very high and prohibitive, so people trade in the black market, not recognized by the government, not protected by our legal system. But in this case, they don't have to pay taxes. Or it can be, in this case, where buying and selling takes place above government price regulations. Other than the black market, landlords might switch from long-term to short-term rentals in order to avoid price controls. So peer-to-peer rental sites like Airbnb have helped people find short-term apartments and get around these rent controls. Now these markets, black markets, and peer-to-peer rental sites that aren't covered under rent control may alleviate some of the deadweight loss because they allow additional apartments to be rented. But what we see is buyers and sellers lose valuable legal protections, especially in the black market. If someone violates a contract, if they promise to do something and don't fulfill their end of the bargain, you can't go to the government, you can't use the legal system in order to force them to uphold their end of the bargain. So now, what are the results of government price controls? It is clear that when the government imposes price controls, that some people are made better off, some people are made worse off, and in total the economy suffers because we're going to have deadweight loss that we experience. So for agricultural price controls, the farmers are made better off, but we have the people that actually buy the crops, they're being made worse off. Likewise, the minimum wage, those workers that are able to keep their jobs after the imposition of the minimum wage, they're made better off, whereas the employers are made worse off, and those that could have had jobs at the lower equilibrium wage but are not able to at the new higher minimum wage are made worse off. And again, there's going to be deadweight loss from those people that are unable to find jobs that would have. And finally, with rent control, some people are made better off, renters. Some are made worse off, landlords, and those who would have had jobs or would have had apartments to rent had we had the equilibrium price instead of price controls. And in general, the economy suffers because those people are unable to rent, so these transactions never take place. Economists very rarely, if ever, recommend price controls, with the exception of a few that advocate for minimum wage laws. So they believe in these cases that there's equity effects that people should make more as a normative judgment that they make to override the efficiency laws. Now we're going to turn our attention to the economic effect of taxes. Taxes are the most important method by which governments fund their activities. And Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes referred to taxes as the price we pay to live in a civilized society. But taxes also distort economic decision making and incentives that individuals face. So in this section, we're going to explore how that happens. And we're going to concentrate on per unit taxes. So these are taxes that are assessed as a particular dollar amount on a sale of a good or service, as opposed to a percentage tax. So, for instance, we'll look at the U.S. federal government imposing an 18.4 cents per gallon tax on gasoline sales in 2015. So this is a fixed dollar amount per unit rather than a percentage. So now let's begin by exploring the effect of a tax on the market for cigarettes. So without this tax on cigarettes, the equilibrium is going to occur at point A. It's where the supply curve S1 crosses the demand curve. The equilibrium price is going to be $5 per pack, and at that price, consumers and producers will be willing to trade 4 billion packs of cigarettes per year. Now let's say that the government imposes a $1 per pack tax on cigarettes. What this is going to do is shift the supply curve up by $1. So we'll move from S1 to S2. So the curve shifts up by $1, the amount of the tax, because what it does is it increases firms' marginal costs by $1 per unit. But the price it's being sold at is not going to be $1 higher because the demand curve is not vertical. Because there's a slope to it, it's going to be where the demand curve crosses this new supply curve. In this case, it's going to be at a price of $5.90, so point B. And at that price, the quantity sold will be 3.7 billion packs of cigarettes per year. So the price paid by consumers after the tax is going to be $5.90, again, where the new supply curve crosses the demand curve. Producers are going to receive the price of $5.90 per pack, so at point B. But after paying the $1 tax to the government, they're left with $4.90. So what that's going to be is at the quantity of 3.7 billion packs of cigarettes, so at the quantity of point B, where that quantity crosses the original supply curve. So consumers pay $5.90, producers receive $4.90 after they pay the tax. Now the government is going to receive the revenue equal to the green shaded box. So it'll be the difference between what consumers pay and what producers actually retain. So it'll be, in this case, $1 because that's the amount of the tax, times the quantity of packs of cigarettes being sold. So 3.7 billion packs per year. Now there's also going to be a deadweight loss because remember, in equilibrium, we were buying and selling 4 billion packs of cigarettes per year. After the tax, because of the increased costs, we're only purchasing and selling 3.7 billion packs of cigarettes per year. Because of these trades that are not taking place because of the higher price, we end up with a deadweight loss in society, which can be represented by the yellow triangle. Now, the deadweight loss is going to be very small in this case because consumers are not very sensitive to price, and that's why we have this very steep sloping demand curve. A large increase in price causes a small decrease in the quantity demanded. And this should make intuitive sense if we know about cigarettes. Cigarettes are physically addictive. So people will be willing to satisfy that addiction even at a much higher price. They may purchase a little bit less than before, but they're still largely going to purchase cigarettes because of that physical need that accompanies its usage. Now let's look at the incidence of a tax on gasoline for another example. So when there's no tax on gasoline, the equilibrium price is going to be $2.50, where the supply curve S1 crosses the demand curve. And at this price, consumers will demand 144 billion gallons of gas per year. So let's suppose the federal government places a 10-cent per gallon federal excise tax on gasoline. What that's going to do is shift the supply curve up by 10 cents. So when we place this 10-cent per gallon tax on, we're going to shift up the supply curve from S1 to S2. So now the price consumers are going to pay is where the new supply curve, S2, crosses the demand curve. So that price will be $2.58. And at the price of $2.58, the quantity traded will be 140 billion gallons of gasoline per year. Now at that quantity, firms are going to receive $2.48. So where that quantity traded crosses the original supply curve. And that's going to be 10 cents less than the new higher price, $2.58, that consumers are paying. So now the price consumers pay rises from $2.50 to $2.58. So they're going to bear 80 cents of this tax. Whereas producers, the price they receive after they pay the tax is going to fall from $2.50 to $2.48. So they end up losing 2 cents or paying 2 cents per gallon. So consumers end up paying 8 cents or 80% of the tax, and the sellers of gasoline end up paying 2 cents or 20% of the tax. So who actually pays for this tax? In the market for gasoline that we just looked at, the buyers effectively paid 80% of the tax, and the sellers paid 20%. So we refer to who actually pays the tax as the tax incidence, or the actual division of the burden of tax between the buyers and the sellers in a market. So what determines the tax incidence is not whoever has the legal obligation to pay the tax. It's whoever's going to be less sensitive to price. So in the previous two examples, for cigarettes and for gasoline, we've seen consumers were not very sensitive to price compared to producers. So that's why consumers ended up paying more of the tax. So let's return to this gasoline tax. But in this case, we're going to say that the buyers have the legal obligation to pay the 10-cent tax on gasoline. Overall, the price they pay, that sellers receive, and the quantity traded are going to remain the same. So let's look at this. If we put a 10-cent per gallon tax on gasoline that consumers have to pay, that's going to shift the demand curve down. So we'll shift it down from D1 to D2. In D1, at the original demand curve, consumers are willing, or the price of gas is going to be $2.50. And at that price, the quantity traded is going to be 144 billion gallons of gasoline per year, just like in the previous example. Now that we add on this tax and we shift the demand curve down to D2, Where the new demand curve crosses the supply curve, is going to be at $2.48. So that's the price that sellers of gasoline are going to receive with this new 10-cent per gallon tax imposed. The price that consumers are going to pay is going to be at this new quantity, so 144 billion gallons of gasoline per year, where that crosses the initial demand curve, so at the price of $2.58. So what we see is that the incidence of the tax, who actually pays the tax between the buyers and the sellers, does not depend on who has the legal obligation to pay the tax. It's determined by these supply and demand curves. So like I mentioned, the incidence of the tax is determined by the relative slopes of the supply and demand curve. So a steep demand curve means that buyers do not change how much they buy when price changes. They're relatively insensitive to a change in price. So this results in them bearing much more of the burden of the tax. If consumers have a shallow demand curve, that means that buyers change how much they buy a lot when price changes. So they're very sensitive to a change in price. They could not be forced to accept much of the burden of the tax in this case because they're going to decrease how much they purchase substantially when there's an increase, a relatively small increase in price. And the same thing applies to sellers. So if there's a steep supply curve, sellers do not change how much they supply to the market when the price changes. So they'll end up with much of the burden of the tax. So let's look at one final example to end this section. Let's look at the burden of Social Security tax. So the FICA tax is a 15.3% of wages, and it funds Social Security and Medicare. By law, employers pay half. They're physically the ones that pay the federal government, and workers pay the other half. But who really ends up with most of the burden of this tax? It doesn't matter who writes the check. Who faces more of the burden? The answer is going to depend on who's less sensitive to changes in wages. Is this going to be employers, or is it going to be workers? Workers, it turns out, are relatively insensitive to their wages. Now, what I mean by that is they don't change their hours of work decisions. They don't tend to work more or fewer hours when their wages change. So workers end up bearing most of the burden of this tax. So let's use the supply and demand graphs on the right to show what happens. So the first panel, the first supply and demand curve, shows the Social Security tax being paid by employers. Because the employers are the consumer side of the market, that's going to shift down the demand curve. So let's say wages were $10 in equilibrium. The wages that firms were forced to pay for employees increased from $10 to $10.05. However, because of this additional $1 Social Security tax, the workers only take home $9.05. So they bear 95% of the tax. Now let's look at the other hand, where Social Security tax is paid by the workers themselves. Because the workers are the producer's side of the labor market, a $1 Social Security tax is going to shift the supply curve up. So it's going to shift it up from $10 in equilibrium to $10.05. That's what they're going to be paid. But then they have to pay that $1 tax. So after they pay that $1 tax, they take home $9.05. So again, workers end up bearing 95% of the tax. So no matter who pays the Social Security tax, these FICA taxes, most of the burden is falling on employees.